Hey everyone, welcome back to Bryan's Mysteries and Adventures on Trail, and today's case is a little different than normal, but it is one of the most highly requested cases that I covered, so I wanted to cover it for you. And the majority of the case takes place in the 1970s and early 80s in Anchorage, Alaska, and really this was during the boom, so to speak. I mean, Anchorage, Alaska, if any of you are familiar with it, it's the biggest city that is in Alaska, and it's a beautiful city. I mean, when you see pictures of it, it's got a backdrop against mountains and on the water, and it's just a really attractive city. And in the 60s, 70s, there was a boom because they were building this Alaskan pipeline, which is this massive pipeline that goes from across the entire state of Alaska. Of course, for the workers, it was a life of timber and toil, and I'm sure that many of them went out there because Alaska is the final frontier and they wanted to enjoy it. You know, it's known for its beautiful scenery and animals and wildlife. And according to the history, when this construction brought a boom into the cities. And of course, when it brought all these people in, it also brought more crime and those kind of things too. Now, really, to understand this case, we have to go back to a man named Robert Hansen, who is just this average guy from Esterville, Iowa. He was born in 1939. And apparently he grew up, he was sort of one of those shy guys, and he didn't get along with his father, but I mean, that happens with a lot of people. But apparently he had a stutter, and in his high school years, he developed severe acne, which I guess permanently scarred him in ways. And he always sort of had this gripe about not being able to be with the attractive women that he wanted to be. And he never gave that up. He kept that with him his whole life. And that is, like the old Chinese proverb says, that's holding on to hate in your heart is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. And he did find ways he got into archery and apparently hunting, and apparently he was very skilled at both of them. He won several awards in hunting and archery. That took his mind off things, I guess, for a while. And then he did enlist in the Army. Now, he was only in the Army Reserve for a year and was discharged. I couldn't find the reason as to why he was discharged. However, then he worked as a drill instructor at the police academy in Pocahontas, Iowa, which is unbelievable when you hear the rest of the story. And he did meet a young woman, and he did get married in the summer of 1960. However, it wasn't long after that, on December 7th of 1960, when Hansen was arrested for burning down the Pocahontas County Board of Education garage that they housed all the buses in. And he did this solely because he was taking out his revenge for being unpopular in high school. Now, he was, of course, arrested, and he served roughly 20 months of a 3-year prison sentence in the Amorosa State Penitentiary. While he was incarcerated, he was diagnosed with what they called manic depressive. We would now call it bipolar disorder. That wasn't as well known back then. And he also was diagnosed with other mental illnesses. And one of the psychiatrists has made it a very specific note that he had a very infantile personality, and he was obsessed with getting back at anyone that he had felt that had wronged him. Now, during this whole time, of course, Hansen's wife filed for divorce while he was incarcerated. Over the next few years, he continued to do these bizarre things, just basic petty theft. He did eventually remarry. He met a woman named Darla, who was a devout Christian, and she was very, very intelligent. She had gotten her master's, and she worked with tutoring young children, and they ended up having 2 children of their own, and subsequently moved to Anchorage, Alaska in 1967, where Hansen opened up a small little bakery just in the middle of downtown Anchorage. And in his free time, he would do his hunting and archery. But it wasn't long before trouble set in. Roughly 4 years after he moved there in 1971, it's believed that he started visiting the strip clubs that were on the area of 4th Avenue in Anchorage. And in 1971, he kidnapped a woman named Susie Hepburn from her apartment, and he was later charged for that crime with assault and they gave him just 3 months for that crime. And his wife, Darla, she stayed with him. She came to visit him, despite him apparently being very verbally abusive to her. Literally within a few days of his release, he went back to the same strip club, that same strip club area, and did the exact same thing. And this time he threatened to kill the young woman, but she agreed not to after he made her write down all the names and addresses of her family. Then in December of 1971, Hansen was again arrested twice, and he pleaded no contest to both one charge with assault with a deadly weapon in an offense involving a housewife, and one attempt involving a sexual assault charge involving one of the strip club workers that he had gotten into his car. He was sentenced to only 5 years in prison, and after only serving 6 months of his sentence, he was placed on some kind of work release program, and he was released to a halfway house, basically back into society. It was a huge miscarriage of justice for these women, and this man had already shown a pattern, and he should have been incarcerated for decades, in my opinion, by that point. And right after he was released, he continued to do what he did, and he actually, instead, he started with the unconnected victim. Many of them were transients and runaways that came up to Alaska, or people just looking for work. And a lot of people, their families didn't even know that they were gone or missing until it was, a long time later. In 1971, there was remains of a female found near the ravine near the Kenai Peninsula. And one of the dancers actually came forward because she started hearing about these missing women, and she reported Hansen to the authorities, and he was arrested. But because of his status in the community, and apparently he was friends with the church minister, they all backed him, saying, oh, he's just the baker and the great member of the community. So he got off. And it's hard to say what he did during these continuing years, but we know he continued to do this behavior. And in 1976, he stole a chainsaw from a Fred Meyer store. He got caught, and he was sentenced for 5 years in prison for that crime. Now, do you find the irony? He was sentenced for more time for stealing that chainsaw than some of these assault charges that he had on these women years prior. It just blows my mind. He was sentenced to the 5 years. He also required to receive psychiatric treatment for his bipolar disorder. And I don't know how he managed this, but he took his case all the way to the Alaskan Supreme Court, got his sentence reduced, and he was released with time served. Unbelievable. While he was out, he managed to get his pilot license, and he also had a small little plane, a Piper PA-18 Super Cub, that was over at this airfield that was only a few miles away from where he lived, and he continued to stalk victims. Now, between 1978 and 1983, 4 separate remains were discovered in different areas. Now, the bizarre part was that they were being found in areas way out, sort of in the middle of nowhere. The first was actually discovered by a construction team that was out in this very remote area of Alaskan Road, and they were out there doing their work, and they found these remains, and of course they immediately reported it to the authorities, and unfortunately they weren't able to identify the remains, so they called her Lieutenant Annie. But then in May of 1980, the remains of Johanna Messina were found in a gravel pit in a remote area. Then in September of 82, the remains of Sherry Moreau were discovered buried near the Nick River. These just kept happening. These police knew that they had this huge problem, and of course they didn't feel that they were equipped. They were trying their best. They had a lot of people on it. Detective Glenn Floth of the Alaskan State Troopers had been a part of this whole team since the beginning when they found the first remains, and he knew that this was the same person. He knew that they were all connected to the same perpetrator. He contacted the FBI and Special Agent Don Douglas for help. And this guy, John Douglas, was an offender profiler, which back in the early 80s, profiling was still a very new thing. And this Douglas came up with this profile that he said that this killer would be an experienced hunter with low self-esteem, have a history of being rejected by women, and would feel compelled to keep souvenirs of his victims, and that he would also most likely have a stutter. And I just thought that was unbelievable, that he was able to pin down this offender based on the evidence that they had. And this really was a huge break, or would be a huge break for the case moving forward. In 1983, June 13th of 1983, Hansen offered a sex worker, Cindy Paulson, who was a young woman, $200 to do something. Well, she would get into his car, and this was part of his MO, and then he would pull a gun on them, and he would sometimes drive them to his home, often assaulting them there, and some he would actually return back to their homes or in Anchorage and just drop them off, threatening them. But what he started doing was taking them to this private airfield, the Merrifield Airport in Anchorage, where he owned this plane, and he would fly them out to this little cabin that he owned near the Nick River, which is in the Manatuska Valley. Sorry if I mispronounced that. And he would literally, after assaulting them and oftentimes doing even much worse things, he would get them all disoriented, and he would put them into the forest, and he would literally hunt them down like prey, sort of like a modern day The Most Dangerous Game. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that story that we all read in high school, but I mean, it was literally insane, and I can't imagine how terrifying it was for these women. With Cindy Paulson, however, she was amazing, and she is one of the heroes of this story, because after he assaulted her, he had put her in the back of his car. Of course, she was handcuffed, and he was taking her to this airfield, and he told her that he was going to be taking her to this cabin near the Nick River. And where this cabin was, it was accessible only by boat or plane. Well, when she was placed in the back seat of the car, apparently her hands cuffs, they were cuffed in front of her body. And when Hansen was busy, over by the plane loading it, she saw her chance to escape, and she got out of the driver's side door. She ran, and she made it to 6th Avenue. Of course, Hansen was chasing her, but she managed to pass down a truck driver, a man by the name of Robert Yount, who was nice enough and kind enough to stop. And he drove her to this place called the Mush Inn, and she, of course, was pleading with the clerk to call the police. Her boyfriend at the Big Timber Motel, I guess that's where he worked. The police department was called, of course. The Anchorage police immediately arrived at the Mush Inn, but Cindy had already been taken by cab to the Timber Motel. Of course, the Anchorage police went right over to the Big Timber Motel, and they found her still handcuffed and alone, and she was taken down to police headquarters. She described Hansen. She told them where his home was, about the basement, the airport, the plane. And they honestly, at first, they didn't take her seriously. They thought she was, just a young topless dancer, and they were just kind of blowing her off. But the house, they was quickly identified to be belonging to Bob Hansen, and since they had this profiler in working the case, they went over, they questioned him, and of course Hansen denied Cindy's accusations. He was saying she was just trying to cause trouble for him and trying to extort money from him. Of course, he also somehow managed to muster up an alibi from one of his friends. However, the FBI agent, John Douglas, he had created this profile, and based on this and all this evidence, they were able to get a search warrant for his house. On October 27th, 1983, investigators, along with the FBI, they uncovered various jewelry belonging to some of the victims, as well as various weapons in this hideaway in Hansen's attic. They also found this aeronautical chart with little X's marked on it, hidden behind one of Hansen's headboards, and many of these marks matched the sites where previous remains and then others would later be discovered. Of course, he was immediately arrested. Of course, this SOB was when confronted with all this, he tried to deny it, saying that he was blaming the women and just tried to justify his actions. Eventually, the evidence was, when it was presented to him, he admitted to a spree of various attacks against these women that had started in 1971, and he actually did confess to just unspeakable acts and things that I can't go into here. And he was sentenced by a jury for 461 years plus life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to the U.S. Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, then returned back up to Alaska to the Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, and he eventually passed away in May of 2014 of God knows what. But this man just cut a swath of unspeakable terror across the country, and who knows how many that we don't know about. He was actually only convicted of 4 murders, but he is credited with at least 17 known deaths. Frank Rothschild was the prosecutor and described him as an evil genius, and said that during his interrogation, he could see how Hansen transformed from being the little nice guy neighbor to this evil genius right before his eyes. And he said that this person that had killed these women was just an awful, awful person, that he thought he could truly outsmart everybody else, and people like this are just evil, and he was punished accordingly. And even though his wife Darla was with him this whole time, she knew that he was up to no good, but she just thought that he was going to these strip clubs, and she would fly to Arkansas and be with her family for months at a time. And this unfortunately allowed Hansen to get away with a lot more going unseen because she wasn't in the house. And I think that Cindy Paulson in this case is just a true hero, and for her bravery, and then just for standing up for herself, even when the police wouldn't listen to her and they weren't treating her like they should. I mean, it doesn't matter what your occupation is. Everybody deserves to be treated accordingly. And if you're found in that state, I mean, how could you not be taken seriously? And to the FBI agent for creating that profile, that was just unbelievable. And that really did help convince the Anchorage police to go after Hansen, because they were just sort of stalling with this investigation. They were working on it, but it was the combination of Cindy Paulson's identification and the FBI's profile and everything coming together that really brought this monster down. And the media at the time nicknamed him the Butcher Baker, because here he was masquerading as this just nice guy baker, and yet he was this crazy monster that was doing these terrible things to these women in his community, and God only knows where else. And what's so frustrating is he was arrested so many times before this, and this one article did a great job saying how these guys often are arrested many times for similar crimes, and they're let off with these little sentences, or they're set right back into society several times after they've done the same thing. And it's like, it would have been so easy to prevent if you just kept them in jail. And it's just so sad. My thoughts and prayers go out to the families of all the women that were taken by this terrible monster, or the women that survived and had to endure his mania and just horrific behavior. And my thoughts and prayers go out to the investigators and the FBI agents and everyone who helped bring him down. And I know there's a lot I can't say here on YouTube, but this guy was an absolute monster in every way, shape, or form. I mean, he was basically the definition of evil. And unfortunately, the law let him get off easy in many of these cases, and that was a huge misjustice, because if he had been kept in prison after the first few times, we could have saved a lot of lives. So that's just really sad. I want to thank everybody for watching as always, and please be respectful in the comments if you choose to leave them. Special thank you to co.ag for providing the background music, and I'll see everybody in the next one. Take care. Hey everyone, thanks for sticking with me to the end. A few guys had mentioned a few things about the last video with when I'm doing another person's story, speaking in the first person. I mean, I'm not sure why that confuses a lot of people, because there's literally hundreds of channels out there where that's all there is people sending them in stories, and then the narrator reads them in the first person. And I guess people like that, the people who send in the stories, because they want it told with a sense of feeling, and it sounds more real that way. I hope you're all having a wonderful new year, and hope you had a wonderful holiday, and wishing everybody a great week, and I will see everybody in the next one. Take care.